I'm Teisha Bader, in for Mark Golub, and in the news, the passage in Congress of the Holocaust Expropriated Art Recovery Act, or HEAR Act. Bipartisan legislation that eases the return of Nazi-stolen art to its rightful owners or heirs by extending the statute of limitations on such claims. The Senate passed the HEAR Act on December the 10th. The House of Representatives passed the bill on December the 6th. The legislation now awaits President Obama's signature. The bill was introduced in the Senate by Texas Republican Senators Ted Cruz and John Cornyn and Democrats Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut and Charles Schumer of New York. The bill was introduced in the House by Republican Virginia Congressman Bob Goodlatte and Democratic New York Congressman Jerrold Nadler, who is also senior member of the House Judiciary Committee and ranking member of the Subcommittee on Intellectual Property. Congressman Nadler joins us now on the phone from Washington. Welcome, Congressman. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us on JBS.
Pleasure.
So firstly, congratulations on the passage of this legislation. Can you explain a little bit about what the HEAR Act actually says and does?
Well, nearly 20 years ago, in 1998, the United States brought together 44 nations to produce a set of principles on Nazi-confiscated art. They agreed that steps should be taken expeditiously to achieve a just and fair solution. Then, in 2009, the U.S. joined 45 other nations to issue what was known as the Teisha Declaration that reaffirmed those principles. Unfortunately, what has happened is that many American victims have still been unable to pursue their claims in court because of restrictive statutes of limitations in the states, in the various states, not federal. There was no federal statute of limitations. And these laws, these statutes, generally require a claimant to bring a case within a limited number of years from when the loss occurred or should have been discovered. But very often, in some cases, that would have required the claim to be brought before the World War II ended, which was ridiculous. And a lot of states were dismissing such cases, not on the merits, but simply because of statutes of limitations. So this bill would set a uniform 6-year federal statute of limitations for the claims of Nazi-confiscated art, but the 6 years would run from the time that the identity and location of the artwork, in other words, where is it now, and the ownership interest of the claimant are actually discovered. The bill would also restore the claims of people whose cases were dismissed previously because of state statutes of limitations. So it would enable all such people to reopen their cases and would give a 6-year statute of limitations from when they actually found out, not should have found out, they actually found out where the location is and where it is.
So I would imagine in a lot of cases, family members, as you mentioned, don't even find out about the fact that artwork was perhaps stolen or that it had to be sold under duress many, many years after the Holocaust, and maybe, they're just recently finding out about this information.
Well, that's right. That's exactly right, and that's why we have the bill. And it may even be that some people won't find out until the future, and the bill will then operate. This would allow people, regardless of when they find out, to have 6 years from that time to bring a lawsuit, to try to recover the property.
So a lot of this artwork is in Europe at museums or being held by collectors. How is this an American issue, if you can speak to that?
Well, there may be American citizens or residents of the United States who have claims on this, who are the rightful owners of this art. So if the Nazis stole art, and the Nazis carried out, in addition to all their horrible genocide and everything else, they carried out the biggest systematic art theft in the history of the world. So if the Nazis stole art or compelled its sale by your ancestors, and maybe you knew about it, maybe you didn't, but you now find out that art piece hanging in the Louvre or hanging in the London Museum really ought to belong to you because it was stolen by the Nazis from your grandfather or great-grandfather or whatever, or mother, you can now bring a suit and recover that under this bill.
Now, does this also cover people who had to sell their art under duress? In other words, if there were people who were trying to perhaps flee Nazi persecution, sold the art in order to have the money to be able to do so, it would relate to them as well?
Well, depends on the circumstance, I would think.
Okay.
As a general rule, and I'm not really an expert on this, but as a general rule, if you sold a piece, your grandfather sold a piece of art because the Nazis pointed a gun at you and said you better sell it, or in some other way forced you to sell it, that's certainly duress, and you certainly was not a rightful sale. You certainly could sue to recover. If there was no such duress, but simply you sold the artwork to get money to flee, I'm not so sure. I don't know.
Okay, it's an interesting question. Now, when talking about art recovery, it may seem, compared to the atrocities that survivors of the Holocaust experienced, of course, getting back a piece of artwork is maybe a minor thing, but can you talk about what the actual significance is of this gesture, of some small token of justice for these people who have suffered so much?
Well, it depends. First of all, it may be worth a lot of money or may not. I mean, so there's that. But also, some of this artwork has deep significance to families. There was a movie recently about a woman, a true story, about a woman who went through contortions in one of the European countries to try to recover a famous painting of her aunt. It was a family painting, not only that belonged to her family, but was a painting of a member of her family. There was a real family and sentimental value there. Art has all sorts of value besides monetary. Now, of course, nothing can compare to the systematic murder and the Shoah. Nothing can compare to that. Nonetheless, to the extent we can make people not whole, we can never make people whole, but to the extent we can make people, help people recover what was stolen from them and their families, we should, knowing we can never do justice for what was done by the Nazis, but to the extent we can, we should.
Of course, and it's interesting. I was also thinking of the movie that you mentioned, Woman in Gold.
Yes.
It really, watching it really brought home why a piece of art is more than just a piece of art, however beautiful. The movie really does touch on, as you said, the relationship and the incredible family connection and emotional value that particular piece of art had. And Helen Mirren did a beautiful job in the film, and she actually, I know, gave testimony in regards to Nazi looted art.
And there's one other thing, too. If you are a survivor of the Holocaust or a descendant of a survivor of the Holocaust, it's bad enough that the Nazis may have murdered members of your family or people you knew. It's bad enough they forced you to flee and uprooted your childhood or whatever. And it's bad enough they stole art. But if that art is still hanging, maybe not hanging in a place derived from the Nazis, a German museum, or even a non-German museum that was sold from a German, it's wrong and painful.
Absolutely. And the issue of people fleeing brings me to another question. I know you've been very involved in legislation regarding Jewish refugees from Arab countries. You recently, in fact, spoke at the Israeli embassy on this issue. Can you tell us a little bit about this and why it's so important?
Well, I've been involved in this issue for about, I suppose, 10 or 11 years now. I passed a resolution in the House about 6-7 years ago, and now which is a resolution, and I have a bill now to make it law. We know that, the world talks about, the UN talks about all the time about the Arab or Palestinian refugees who left what became Israel in 1948. And we have and there's a whole thing about the Palestinian refugees and compensation. And we know that if there is, God willing, ever a peace agreement, the Arabs want repatriation, the right of return. The Israelis say they can't do that, obviously, but there will clearly be some sort of compensation for Arab refugees or descendants of Arab refugees. What I said, now, there were about 600,000 Arab refugees in 1948-49. What no one ever talks about is that there were about 850,000 Jewish refugees who were kicked out of Arab countries and Iran in 1948 through 56. Basically, not unlike the Arab refugees, not during a war, but kicked out purely because of animus and anti-Semitism and hostility because of the creation of Israel. Most of these people didn't wind up in refugee camps, but most of them went to Israel and were absorbed into the population of Israel and are today the majority, or their descendants are the majority of the population of Israel. Some went to the United States and other places, but most went to Israel. So you have two populations in effect, the Arab refugee population and the Jewish refugee population. And I got very upset that in all discussions of compensation for the Arab refugees, you never hear of anything about compensation for the Jewish refugees. And certainly there ought to be. So what my resolution said was that, and I got this passed a few years ago in the House, was that when and if real serious negotiations take place on an Israeli-Palestinian peace settlement and the question of compensation of the Arab refugees is brought up, the State Department must bring up the question and insist on compensation for the Jewish refugees in exactly the same manner and to exactly the same extent at least. And that resolution passed in the House, and now I've introduced a bill not just to reaffirm it, but to require the State Department periodically to report on what it is doing to make sure that the question of compensation of the Jewish refugees from the Arab countries and Iran is brought up when any of this is discussed.
Now, touching on some recent news, President-elect Donald Trump announced the naming of his advisor, David Friedman, as the next U.S. ambassador to Israel. How do you feel about that appointment? What are your concerns?
Well, I think, judging from what I've read about the appointment, it is an insult to most Jews. This is an extremist. Mr. Friedman seems to be an extremist who is called President Obama an anti-Semite, which is absurd, and has said that Jews who support a two-state solution in Israel, which the majority of the American Jewish population does, are worse than capos, far worse than capos. So in other words, the Jews who disagree with him are worse than capos who work for the Nazis. This is not, as I said, that appointment is an insult to most of the Jewish population.
Now, Congressman, you've been in public service for many, many years, since 1976, I believe, when you joined the New York State Assembly. Did you always know that this was your career path? Is this something you thought about as a youngster?
Yes, I really wanted to be involved in public affairs probably since I was in high school. In high school, I wanted to do two things. I wanted to be in public affairs and politics, and I wanted to be in molecular biology and astrophysics. I never figured out how to combine them.
Okay, there's still time.
Well, but I always wanted to feel that I made a difference, that I could affect people, that I could help people's lives, that I could look and say, I made that better. And that's I always knew that.
And in fact, I mean, you grew up in Brooklyn. I know you represent now a cross-section of parts of Manhattan and Brooklyn as well. What is it like to actually be born and bred in the place that you now represent, the people who live there?
Well, I was born in Brooklyn. I spent my childhood either in Brooklyn or in a farm in New Jersey, actually, near Lakewood. And then we moved back to Brooklyn. I became a Manhattanite when I went to college. But so my district is Manhattan and Brooklyn, both of which I know because I've lived in them most of my life. It's a great privilege to represent it, obviously, and it's a great privilege to represent a very complex community and a very politically literate community, a community that follows these things and is very active and involved.
Now, I know you were at the recent Hanukkah celebrations held by President Obama at the White House, his last Hanukkah celebrations. Can you tell us about that? And were you at the afternoon or the evening receptions?
No, I was at the evening reception.
Okay.
My wife and I were at the evening reception. We came in from New York for it. It was a very nice and pleasant reception. It was also sort of bittersweet because a lot of the people who were there, from the administration, obviously this is their last Hanukkah party as part of the administration. It was the last for President Obama, and it was bittersweet in that sense.
And the family of the late Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, and President of Israel, Shimon Peres, of course, were there at the event in the evening. His son,
Yes.
Chemi, his
Chemi was there, and he had a number of people were there from the family. And, of course, I was at the funeral. I was at President Peres's funeral a few weeks ago. He was one of the giants in Jewish history and world history, and certainly one of the giants of the century. So,
absolutely. So you got a chance to know him a little bit?
I met Prime Minister Peres only a few times, but I wouldn't say I knew him, but I'd met him 5 or 6 times.
And what was the funeral like in Jerusalem? I mean, we covered it extensively here, and we were all profoundly affected by his death. What were your feelings?
Well, my feelings were that I was a great admirer of President Peres, of Shimon Peres. I thought he was the living embodiment of Jewish history for almost a century, Jewish and Israeli history for almost a century. I mean, he was a man, we think of him today as seeker of peace and so forth, which he was, but he was also one of the people primarily responsible for Israel's survival in its first 20 years. He was Ben-Gurion's emissary to get arms during the War of Independence when the United States was embargoing arms to Israel. We forget about that. And he helped arrange smuggling of arms into Israel, and then he helped arrange at the age of 29, I think he was Director General of the Defense Ministry. And then he set up the Israeli aircraft industry. He then set up the nuclear program. He was the architect of Israel's security, and then became a great peacemaker later, or attempted peacemaker. He was very few people have the scope of his life.
Absolutely.
Or the impact on Jewish history and in world history.
And I know President Obama, from what I've read, felt very close to Peres. It spoke about him at the Hanukkah reception. Chemi Peres wrote that he felt very, very warm being there at that event and really welcomed by the president, and that lovely tribute was paid to his father. What was your sense?
Well, it was a lovely tribute, and, Chemi did say all that. And, at the funeral, you had not only President Obama, you had President Clinton, who gave a major speech and who was very close to Prime Minister and President Peres. It was, as I said, it was a bittersweet Hanukkah party, and obviously came only a month or two after the funeral. A watershed event in history, in Jewish history and world history.
And Congressman, lastly, what are your thoughts now about possible peace in Israel, the U.S.-Israel relationship, possibilities for a two-state solution? You're optimistic?
I don't know. Obviously, we have to hope for a peaceful solution. The two-state solution, as far as I'm concerned, and I think most American Jews believe this, is the only solution that is consistent with Israeli security and the Jewish and democratic state going forward. Therefore, it's got to be done. The president-elect has spoken on both sides of this, so I don't know what he's appointed an ambassador who is an extremist, who is against the two-state solution and says that anybody who's for the two-state solution is worse than a capo. On the other hand, he's made statements for it. He's made statements against it. I'm not sure he knows where he is from one day to the next. We'll see. I certainly hope that we can proceed on that because it is the hope. If you believe in a Jewish and a democratic state going forward, it's the way to go.
Congressman, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. I know you're incredibly busy. We hope to speak to you again soon and speak further about legislation that you are sponsoring. And again, congratulations on the HERE Act going through.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Congressman Jerrold Nadler is senior member of the House Judiciary Committee and ranking member of the Subcommittee on Intellectual Property. He is a co-sponsor of the Holocaust Expropriated Art Recovery Act, which just passed in Congress and now awaits the signature of President Barack Obama. As always, thank you to our director, Sloan Copeland, production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, JBS Associate Director, Dara Golub, and editors, Dennis Golan and John McDevitt. I'm Teisha Bader in for Mark Golub on this edition of In the News.